Good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this third event in Arts Worcester's speaker series on Black visual arts and contemporary culture. Tonight, we are joined by Erin Corrales-Diaz, who is the Assistant Curator of American Art at the Worcester Art Museum. When Erin was a doctoral student studying art history, she came across the collaborative AfriCOBRA, which we'll hear about this evening, and in particularly the brilliant colored image you saw as you came in. That electrifying moment led her to a career of researching, teaching, exhibiting, and acquiring the work of Black artists at a range of institutions. Here in Worcester, Reginald Gammon's 1964 work, Holy Family, is only the most visible of her accomplishments in this effort. Erin, welcome, and I turn the virtual mic over to you.
All right, well, thank you. Let me, Allie, could you make me a host so I may share my screen, please? Excellent, thank you. All right. Here we go. So welcome. I am really honored to have been asked by Arts Worcester to give this mini art history webinar about historical figures in Black art. Now, while the first two parts of this speaker series focused on contemporary Black artists, I want to give you all some foundational background on just a few of the many leaders and influencers in Black art history and in their legacies. So my doctoral dissertation was actually on the art of the American Civil War and Reconstruction, particularly working within the realm of disability studies. But I've been particularly invested in the last decade, engaging with redefining or re-envisioning the art historical canon to include more diverse and inclusive narratives. And this includes African American art. So on the screen are two images I hope are somewhat familiar to you all. Understanding historical African American art takes on greater urgency and poignancy when you consider these two photographs. So on the left, we have the presentation of Landscape with Rainbow by Robert S. Duncanson to President Biden and Vice President Harris. Painted in 1859, Duncanson's subject is the American landscape a few years before the catastrophic American Civil War. His vision of a pastoral paradise can be interpreted as a last effort of peace before the war or as hope for the future. Duncanson, a successful Black artist from Cincinnati, fell into obscurity before being rediscovered in the 1990s. It is a timely painting made even more meaningful following a tumultuous 2020 presidential election. And on the right, we have the White House's dining room during the Obama's administration. And First Lady Michelle Obama selected Alma Thomas's Resurrection, which you can see in the back of the room. Thomas, who was an educator and an artist in Washington, D.C. for most of her career, became the first African-American woman to be in the White House's collection. Her brilliant strokes of color in a concentric circle presents an abstract vision of resurrection, a symbolic addition to the home of the first African-American president. So it's the legacy of Duncanson and of Thomas that continue to inform the work of Black art today, represented here by contemporary Black artists Kahinde Wiley and Amy Sherald in their portraits of the Obamas. I begin this evening's lecture in this manner to bring home two distinct points. One, in order to know the present, one must also learn about the past. And two, that there are many more amazing Black artists in our history than what we'll be discussing this evening. And to that end, Arts Worcester has an ongoing and continually updated resources page that includes several websites, texts, and videos for you to continue your own study. And I know that that'll show up in the chat below. I opted to select 3 figures in Black art history that serve as leaders and influencers for contemporary art. So Henry Ossawa Tanner, one of the first African-American artists to achieve international acclaim. Loïs Mailou Jones, whose dual roles as an artist and art educator inspired generations of Black students to pursue careers in the arts. And the artist collective AfriCOBRA, an acronym that stands for African Commune of Bad Relevant Artists, and its enduring impact on the relationship between art and activism. So from Tanner in the late 19th century to AfriCOBRA in the 1960s and 1970s, we'll trace the rich and complex developments in African-American art history that are manifested in their subject matter, medium, and influence. We'll consider how each figure responds to their particular historical moment, engage with their identities, and negotiate the national paradigms that shape artistic recognition. Now, this is by no means comprehensive. We can only discuss so much in such a short period of time, but I hope that you will be left eager to learn more. So we'll start in the 19th century with Henry Ossawa Tanner. And we start with him because of his trailblazing status, his international acclaim, and how he mentored future generations of African-American artists. His stature was apparent even in his lifetime, as he's situated on the cover of the Crisis's issue from August 1925. And he's positioned here alongside Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois. And I'm sorry that the library stamp is somewhat obscuring Tanner, but there he is. Tanner was born on June 21st, 1895 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to Benjamin and Sarah Tanner. Tanner's father was a college-educated teacher and a minister who would later become a bishop in the African Methodist Episcopalian Church. Sarah Tanner was a former slave whose mother sent her north to Pittsburgh through the Underground Railroad. And in 1864, the Tanners settled in Philadelphia, and it's in this city where his early artistic interests were developed. Now, Tanner's father wasn't particularly keen on his son pursuing a fine arts career, but eventually the family relented, and Tanner would go on to enroll in the prestigious Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, or PAFA. And you see the building on the right here in this 1900s photograph. So when Tanner enrolled in 1880, he was the sole African-American student at the academy. Now, PAFA was undergoing a significant curriculum change at this time. They were moving away from drawing from plaster casts in exchange for live models, dynamic anatomy lectures, and even dissections. This shift was led by the dynamic and rebellious Thomas Akins, who exerted the greatest influence on Tanner's early style. Akins' uncompromising realism, he did not idealize his sitters, and his deep interest in psychology can be seen in Tanner's painting of his sister Sarah on the left. Tanner would become a favorite student of Akins, and Akins would immortalize this artist in the portrait on the right. Despite Tanner's abilities and his drive, the Philadelphia art world proved difficult, and he faced discrimination both at school and in trying to sell his work in the city. So he opted to leave PAFA after 2 years with the intent to save enough money to go abroad. And he accomplishes this in 1891. Tanner leaves for Europe and ends up settling in Paris. In Paris, he found a more racially tolerant climate than what he had experienced in the States. And other than the occasional jaunt back to America, he would remain abroad in Paris until his death. In primary source materials, Tanner describes a release of a burden now being in Paris, and that he could now solely focus on his art. He enrolled in the Académie Julienne, a famous Parisian art school, where he was able to continue his life drawings and was exposed to French Impressionism. So in this photograph from around 1900, we see Tanner posing in his studio. And this studio would later become a hub for other African-American artists seeking respite from racism in the States. And I want you to see the scale of which Tanner is working in. It's monumental. And actually in the back, we see two studies for works that we'll look at a bit later, the Resurrection of Lazarus and the Annunciation. It wasn't long before Tanner painted two of his most important works depicting African-American subjects: the Banjo Lesson from 1893 on the right, and the Thankful Poor from 1894 on the left. Both paintings reflect an attentiveness to the transmission of knowledge, an interest in education and in learning, a respect for the working class, and an interest in the ordinary moments of everyday life. In art historical terms, we would call these genre scenes. Tanner was able to subvert the prevalent negative stereotypes of minstrelsy and other caricatures through his naturalistic portrayal. His style, influenced by the realism of Akins and the invigorating brushwork and colors of French Impressionism, presents sensitive, poignant, and deeply personal paintings. The work on the right, the Banjo Lesson, also demonstrates an early use of what would be called Tanner blue, this beautiful blue that just sort of radiates throughout the painting. And he would use this Tanner blue throughout his career. Both of these works were exhibited in the States in 1894. And later, the Banjo Lesson was accepted at the Paris Salon, a great honor. And Tanner's positive depictions of African Americans were exactly the type of imagery championed by Black intellectuals Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. But what's interesting about Tanner is that these subjects are extremely rare in his body of work. In fact, the majority are religious scenes and landscapes, work that was more commercially viable abroad. The Banjo Lesson and the Thankful Poor were seen as peculiarly American. And this is also a reaction to his increasing spirituality. Recall that his father was a bishop in the AME church. So the work on the left, The Resurrection of Lazarus, won Tanner a medal in the Paris Salon in 1897. And it was soon after purchased by the French government. So this work is in the Musée d'Orsay. And it was really the first time that had happened before. The Annunciation on the right reflects how Tanner approached his realist art training to biblical subjects. He re-envisions what the moment of an Annunciation would look like, the moment when the Archangel Gabriel announced to Mary that she would bear the Christ child. What would that have really looked like? How would Mary actually have reacted to this? So instead of a very traditional depiction of a winged angel, Gabriel is this column of light, and Mary is shown as an adolescent, dressed in a rumpled Middle Eastern peasant clothing without a halo or any other holy attributes. So Tanner breaks with traditional iconography to present a bold new interpretation, one that is perhaps more relatable than the regal works of the past. I particularly wanted to mention this work because in 2018, this painting was in Worcester for a very short time on loan from the Philadelphia Museum of Art to the Worcester Art Museum. Now, this move from genre scenes to religious paintings was extremely disappointing to many back in America, and in particular, the Black philosopher and Howard University professor Alain Locke. Locke praised Tanner's genre scenes, and he accused works like these on the screen as being far too European. Now, while Tanner was abroad, the Harlem Renaissance was flourishing. But Tanner distanced himself from such work. He continued to paint in his own way and frequently changing his style throughout his career. So Tanner, as many Black artists before and after him, faced such a question of what Black artists should paint and whether there is an obligation to paint race. For a long time, the banjo lesson and the thankful poor were paintings that defined Tanner's oeuvre, obscuring the complete picture of an artist, and by extension, the artistic range of an African-American artist in the art historical canon. Tanner's impact on future African-American artists was not so much stylistic as it was about mentorship and inspiration. Tanner's achievements encouraged a whole group of a younger generation of Black artists. And this includes Aaron Douglas, who growing up in Topeka, Kansas, learned about Tanner, and Tanner inspired him to become a fine artist, as well as Palmer Hayden and Hale Woodruff. All three of these artists would go on to visit Tanner in Paris. And while these artists their artistic styles embraced the social, political, and racial realities of African-American experiences, not readily apparent in Tanner's work, these artists were all indebted to Tanner's legacy. So taking it forward, some contemporary artists have paid respects to this role model through very direct references in their artwork. So Faith Ringgold has written and illustrated a children's book about Henry Ossawa Tanner. And what we see appear on the screen on the left is a print, and it depicts the moment when Tanner is in a park in Philadelphia and he comes across an artist. And this is seen as the catalyst for him to pursue a profession in the visual arts. And on the right, Hale Woodruff, again, someone who went to go study and visit with Tanner, included him as one of the artistic muses in his mural series at Clark Atlanta University. And Tanner is right here. Now, others, such as Alma Thomas, took up religious themes that meant a great deal to Tanner and reworked them by using new materials and a modernist visual language. So I want you to think about this in conjunction with that column of light we saw in Tanner's Annunciation. And on the right, say Glenn Ligon, who over a couple of decades has explored James Baldwin's semi-autobiographical essay, Stranger in the Village. His Stranger Study, number 11, is a meditation on race relations and what it means to be a stranger anywhere. And these were sentiments Tanner experienced a century earlier. I do want to pause for a moment to talk about Ligon's technique because it's really difficult to see through a JPEG on a PowerPoint screen. But Stranger Study number 11 is the result of systemic overlaying of stenciled passages from Baldwin's essay with a black oil stick until they coalesce into near illegibility. Tanner's reach will touch the next artist we're going to discuss as well, Loïs Mailou Jones. And this is in particular through her explorations in Paris. So Jones was on her way to Paris and wanted to study with Tanner, but Tanner passed away 3 months before she arrived. But nevertheless, she really credits this particular artist with her inspiration to study abroad. Jones is from Boston, where she initially lived and worked. And she attended the Boston Museum School of Art and then the Massachusetts Normal School of Art for design courses. And she was there between 1926 and 1927. And afterwards, when she graduated, she worked as a freelance textile designer for the F.A. Foster Company in Boston and the Schumacher Company in New York. And on the screen here in the middle is a photograph of Jones in her studio working on her textile designs. And then there are examples of her textiles on the left and the right. These are vivid with bold flora and fauna in whimsical color schemes and patterns. But Jones realized that her name would never be attached to textile patterns, that in order to become known in history, she would have to become a painter and be able to sign her name. Yet the shift from becoming a designer to a painter wasn't easy for her. And when she applied to her alma mater, the Boston Museum School, to teach, her application was denied. The institution felt that as a Black woman, she should teach in the American South. Now, Jones initially bristled with this suggestion. She had always grown up in New England. But she decided to actually drive down to North Carolina, and she founded the art department at the Palmer Memorial Institute. And her amazing success there would lead her to a position at Howard University. And she would stay there for nearly 50 years, mentoring many subsequent Black artists and encouraging arts education. And this photograph is her at Howard. She's holding textbooks and presumably papers to grade. But you can almost make out one of the titles here. It says, "Making the Brush Behave." This was from Elliot O'Hara's 1935 book. And so she is reading contemporary arts education literature. But at Howard, though, but as a Black woman, Jones faced dual discrimination, though, throughout her lifetime. So at Howard, even though she had secured a position in teaching, she confronted sexism. The chair of the art department had asked if she would paint in the more ladylike medium of watercolor, rather than the more masculine oils. So Jones would teach watercolor and design courses at Howard, but she would continue to paint in oils. Paris was the center of the art world at this time, and the city's positive reception of African-American artists before Jones, such as Tanner, made it all the more appealing. Furthermore, given the city's popularity and geographical location, allowed African-American artists the chance to interact with people of African descent from all over the world. So in 1937, when Jones received a sabbatical from Howard, she set sail for France. And much like Tanner, Jones in her interviews would recount feelings of freedom being in Paris. She would also enroll at the Académie Julienne, just like Tanner, and she became a part of the Parisian art world. And she was incredibly prolific during her year here, creating over 40 paintings. So what we see on the screen are two photographs of Jones in her studio. The one on the left has this kitten on her shoulder, but what I really love about this work is that she is signing her name. She's signing her name on the back of the canvas and on the front of the canvas. And in this work here, you can see her surrounded by all of the different paintings she created during her sabbatical. Now, the one we're going to talk about next, though, happens to be right here. Les Fétiches marks a dramatic break from the academic painting she was primarily working on in Paris, landscapes and still lifes. And this is a break in terms of subject matter and in style. So at the Académie Julienne, her Paris teachers questioned her use of African themes in her paintings. And Jones countered with, "If Picasso and Matisse can do it, why shouldn't I be able to do this?" So the painting depicts 5 African masks and a figurine from various peoples. It should be noted that none of these are confirmed from specific regions. Jones prescribed to Pan-Africanism that stresses the shared commonality of all African people. When we compare Les Fétiches with Pablo Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, It should be apparent how she is critiquing modern art's borrowing from African people without acknowledgement. This painting is a reclamation of Jones's African heritage. The title, Les Fétiches, also makes reference to the term French artist called African art in the 20th century. Her decision to select an African subject and a modernist aesthetic positions her as an artist reconciling with her diasporic roots. It is a work that recalls Alain Locke. Again, recall that this is the Howard University philosophy professor. His rallying cry for the Harlem Renaissance, for African-American artists to look to Africa for inspiration. Jones would continue to explore her diasporic roots for the rest of her life, taking particular interest in the Caribbean and visiting parts of Africa several times in the 1970s with her Howard University students. The Fétiche is a transformative work, one that stems from her earlier paintings, Ascent to Ethiopia and Africa. The former, on the left, in a stark palette of blue, black, and yellow, traces the progression of Black individuals towards an urban center surrounded by two-dimensional spheres representing art and music and drama. Below, in the bottom right, is a large allegory of Ethiopia wearing an Egyptian headdress that supports the cityscape above. It is a work that pays tribute to the foundational role of Africa in African-American culture. And Africa on the right depicts three sharply defined figures with chiseled features, all executed in vibrant jewel-like tones. It's also a work that really recalls Jones's earlier textile designs. Paris was so formative to Jones that she sought to recreate her experiences back in Washington, D.C. So she formed a Parisian-style salon and invited local artists to hone their skills and exchange critiques twice weekly at her studio. They nostalgically called this the Little Paris Group. The idea was to keep its members inspired during an era where there were few venues where African Americans could exhibit and show their work. And among the members was none other than Alma Thomas. Participation in a collective empowered artists such as Thomas to freely express their creativity and encourage artistic membership. And this would really inspire many of these members to become art educators and activists in the Washington, D.C. region. So the group was relatively short-lived, but it really provided an invaluable service to those communities in the Washington, D.C. area. Black artist collectives played a significant role in the 1960s during a period where issues of race and identity dominated and defined both public and private discourse. One of these collectives was AfriCOBRA. So there's an emphasis on the second syllable, which speaks to their grounding principle in Black liberation. So they are a Chicago-based group who felt that it was incumbent upon themselves to use art directly to address civil rights and civil justice issues. They set out to discover and codify a Black aesthetic and a philosophy for the purpose and meaning of Black art. Now, stepping back just for a minute to the year prior, this adds a bit of context to AfriCOBRA. In response to the Black liberation struggle, a group of artists in Chicago came together to form the Organization of Black American Culture, otherwise known as OBC, in 1967. So Black artists were looking to display their artwork and find exhibition venues. Public spaces offered new opportunities to displaying images of social justice and collective power. And one of OBC's most important projects was the Wall of Respect. It was an outdoor mural featuring images of Black heroes, civic leaders, writers, musicians, sports stars, dancers. You can see Muhammad Ali right here. And this mural became a community gathering place and inspired similar mural projects throughout major cities in the US. So from OBC, some artists decided to continue the work developed there and then found the collective AfriCOBRA in 1968. So these are the 5 founding members of AfriCOBRA. Jeff Donaldson, he was a painter. Jay and Wadsworth Jarrell, a married couple. Jay is a textile designer, a fashion designer, and Wadsworth Jarrell is a painter. Barbara Jones-Hugu, she was the group's primary printmaker, and Gerald Williams, also a printmaker and a painter. And these 5 founding members then created a Black aesthetic philosophy to guide their collective work. They wanted a shared visual language for positive revolutionary ideas. They decided to create democratic artwork that would set aside an I or a me and replace it with us or we. They also wanted to make art for the people, not for critics. So AfriCOBRA's distinct aesthetic of uplifting and positive images of African Americans, characterized by simplified forms, vivid colors, and strong, often competing patterns, would leave, I argue, a lasting impact on contemporary art and culture. So the group met weekly and they discussed revolutionary politics. And in 1970, they produced a manifesto. And these were one of the few organized groups at this time to put their thoughts about a collective aesthetic in writing. And because of that, it is worth going through the various aesthetic principles and philosophies of AfriCOBRA in relationship to the group's artistic output. So their philosophical concepts went as follows. 1, images, a commitment to humanism inspired by African people and their experience. Images which perform some function which African people can relate to directly and experience. The art is the people, people reflect the art, and the art is for the people, not for the critics. So on the screen here, we have Wadsworth Jarrell's Black Family from 1968. This work by Jarrell was in response to AfriCOBRA's first collective group theme after they wrote their manifesto, the Black Family. So the painting has this flurry of bees that run throughout the work. And according to Wadsworth Jarrell, this stands for Black is beautiful. The parents with their wrap their oversized hands and arms around these 2 children in a really monumental and sort of heroic gesture. Now, the theme of the Black family is an important one at this time because in 1965, the racist Moynihan Report, a sociological document produced under Lyndon Johnson's administration, blamed Black communities for what the administration labeled as a declining nuclear family. So AfriCOBRA's theme is a direct rebuttal to this, countering the stereotype of a dysfunctional Black family with positive imagery. This work is also deeply personal to the artist as it's reflective of the artist's own growing family. This is a portrait of Jay, and this is a portrait of their son, Wadsworth Jr. So 2, identification. To define and clarify our commitment as a people to the struggles of African peoples who are waging war for survival and liberation. And on the screen here, we have Jeff Donaldson's Wives of Shango from 1969. Donaldson depicts 3 wives of Shango, a deified Yoruba ruler of thunder and lightning. And as the story goes, these women were very proficient in the art and battle. They would go out with their husband and even taught him a few tricks. But Donaldson depicts these women from the contemporary moment in the 1960s, rather than as a 15th century ruler. And they're wearing 20th century bandoliers that were very fashionable and popular among members of the Black liberation movement. So Donaldson in this work puts forth that Black women are equally capable and important in battle, whether that is physical or political, and makes direct ties to the African diaspora. 3, programmatic, art which deals with concepts that offer positive and feasible solutions to our individual, local, national, and international problems. So this is Carolyn Lawrence. She was a later member of AfriCOBRA, and she produced this painting of Black children playing and dancing and singing with the words "keep your spirit free" written throughout the canvas. So this is a continuation of the collective's first theme of the Black family, and it's a reflection of a pride in one's heritage. Number 4, modes of expression that lend themselves to economical mass production techniques such as poster art, so that everyone that wants one can have one. So as AfriCOBRA strove to be a democratic art, their style was graphic in nature, so as it would be easily lent to prints. Barbara Jones-Hugu was the group's primary printmaker, and she incorporated words and letters into her artwork to make their meaning particularly clear. And we see this also in the work of Carolyn Lawrence and in Wadsworth Jarrell. It was important to AfriCOBRA members that if you were to include words or letters, that this was a part of the composition. It could not just be mere signage. And we see this in Jones's work in the upper right. This is her Unite from 1971. She made an earlier version of this in 1969. And so the word unite, it repeats and it overlaps in this print with triangular shapes that simultaneously reference a megaphone. And in the bottom, this is a photograph of Barbara Jones-Hugu in her Chicago studio, working on prints. So 5, expressive awesomeness, that which does not appeal to serenity, but is concerned with the eternally sublime rather than ephemeral beauty. Art which moves the emotions and appeals to the senses. So here we have Jarrell, the fashion designer of the group, with her urban waltz suit, a work that was inspired by Obasi's Wall of Respect and the graffitied streets in Chicago. So it is a suit made up of different patterns and different fabrics. The lines for the bricks are made out of black velvet, and she wrote her own graffiti onto the suit. Her designs demonstrated that art was not confined to museums or galleries, but it could be on the streets and accessible to the public. And Jarrell wore her design, so here she is wearing the urban wall suit with her children. In addition to the philosophies outlined, AfriCOBRA also had a set of guiding aesthetic principles. 1, free symmetry, the use of syncopated rhythmic repetition, which constantly changes in color, texture, shapes, form, pattern, movement, feature, etc. 2, mimesis at midpoint, design which marks the spot where the real and the unreal, the objective and the non-objective, the plus and the minus meet. A point exactly between absolute abstractions and absolute naturalism. And 3, visibility, clarity of form and line based on the interesting irregularity one senses in a freely drawn circle or organic object, the feeling for movement, growth, changes, and human touch. So on the screen is Wadsworth Jarrell's Revolutionary from 1971. This is a phenomenal work at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. I encourage you all to go see this in person. And this is a portrait of the political activist and civil rights leader, Angela Davis. And words from her speeches, such as struggle, resist, revolution, beautiful, all appear around her, and they form up her body and emanate from her. So by incorporating Davis's own words and AfriCOBRA's signature aesthetic, this portrait depicts the intensity and the power of Angela Davis's activism. It's also worth noting that in this painting, Angela Davis is wearing a suit designed by Jarrell, what she calls the revolutionary suit. This work is three-dimensional. These are wooden dowels that are painted. And this is Jarrell wearing her revolutionary suit. And you can see the urban wall suit to the right. And then to the left actually is J. Jarrell's contribution to the first collective theme of AfriCOBRA, the Black family. This is Ebony family. The other thing I wanted to note about this work is you've probably seen by now that AfriCOBRA likes jam-packed images, jam-packed paintings, jam-packed prints. Every surface was covered. This was a horror vacui, almost a fear of empty spaces. So this was a conscious decision on behalf of the artists. The other guiding aesthetic principles were luminosity, shine, literal and figurative, as seen in the dress and personal grooming of shoes, hair, laminated furniture, faces, knees, or skin. And then finally, color, Kool-Aid color, bright colors with sensibility and harmony. What's interesting about these two aesthetic principles, luminosity and color, is that different members of AfriCOBRA interpreted these principles in varying ways. So for Wadsworth Jarrell, luminosity, shine, to him meant a representation of exceptional skill. Someone shines in their profession or in their abilities. But Jeff Donaldson took this very literally, saying that the paintings or the artwork had to shine. And Wadsworth Jarrell sometimes subscribed to Jeff Donaldson's interpretation of this. And we see this in the work on the right, where that silver is actually tinfoil. The colors of AfriCOBRA, these vibrant, saturated colors, are what they called Kool-Aid colors. For Barbara Jones Hugo, this was a direct reference to that powdered, inexpensive drink with flavors such as cherry, lemon, and lime. But if you ask Wadsworth Jarrell, Kool-Aid had nothing to do with the beverage. Rather, it was in reference to fashionable, hip clothing worn by African Americans at this point in time. So Wadsworth Jarrell's Liberation Soldiers from 1971 uses both foil and Kool-Aid colors to make members of the Black Panthers shine. Between 1970 and 1973, the group exhibited their work to national and international acclaim. So what you have up here on the screen are two covers of exhibition pamphlets. The one on the left depicts examples of the group's work superimposed on top of an image of Africa. Now, that work in particular, that pamphlet, AfriCOBRA 1, 10 in Search of a Nation, this exhibition started and was founded by the Studio Museum. So it went to the Studio Museum. It went to Massachusetts, as you can see here, and then also ended up going to Chicago. Soon thereafter, there would be AfriCOBRA 2 and then AfriCOBRA 3 in 1973. This evening, I've chosen to focus on the first 5 years of the collective, as these are the formative years in establishing their manifesto and developing a body of work reflective of their Black aesthetic. Now, while many of the original members have since moved on to do other things, that they have retired from AfriCOBRA, the collective still exists, and they're known as AfriCOBRA now. AfriCOBRA's legacy is critical to our understanding of how the contemporary Black aesthetic of the African diaspora and the examination of how transnational Black aesthetics relate to culture, politics, and identity. Taking this to the present, we can see elements of AfriCOBRA in the work by contemporary artists Carrie James Marshall and Kahinde Wiley. Marshall tends in his work to depict positive images of Black life, and he also incorporates words and phrases into his work. He's often inspired by the phrase "Black is beautiful." And Kahinde Wiley embodies AfriCOBRA's figurative and literal shine. So he monumentalizes Black men in art historical poses, but wearing their own clothing and their own bling. And in the work on the right, he's also using metallic paints to really make this painting shine. AfriCOBRA's sense of community and vision of art and activism strongly resonates today. We can see this at a local level, with the artists of Worcester's Black Lives Matter mural. So this clearly stems from AfriCOBRA and OBC continuing the work laid out in the Black arts movement. This evening, we trace the aesthetic transformations of three figures in African American art history from the 19th century to the late 20th. And we've seen how these artists faced a continuous negotiation with the past, in the present, and with responses as diverse as the makers themselves. Thank you.
Erin, thank you so much. I know even having a preview of tonight's talk, I learned a huge amount. I have some questions coming in from Facebook. Please, if you have a question for Erin in our next 15 minutes, please put it into the chat. But I'd love to lead with a background process question. You know, your lecture really showed us how artistic influence is not this progressive, neat, linear thing that happens in one direction. It can loop back and forth. And so I wanted to ask you, did you choose these figures because they would complicate that? Or what was your process in selecting these three figures?
A great question, Juliet. Yeah, thinking about methodology, and particularly with my own interest in redefining or talking about the art historical canon, that makes a big deal about which artists I've selected to talk about. And I really wanted to present something outside of Jacob Lawrence or Romare Bearden. I wanted to offer something even more, perhaps some artists you hadn't heard of. So for Henry Ossawa Tanner, I have to say I was really taken when the Annunciation was at the Worcester Art Museum, how little folks knew about him. And I went, wow, he's so important to art history. So I really wanted to add him in this lecture. And I know, you know, sometimes it's hard for a 19th century artist to seem so relevant to the contemporary period, but he is. I mean, he opened those doors, and how many of those artists, such as Aaron Douglas, you know, read about Tanner as a boy and suddenly wanted to become an artist. I also think that his work really pushed the boundaries a bit too. Again, thinking about it in 19th century terminology. And Loïs Mailou Jones, she's a personal favorite of mine. And I really thought it was important to talk about a woman artist and to talk about those struggles, you know, the intersectionality of being a Black woman artist at this point in time. And AfriCOBRA, as Juliet mentioned in my introduction, that expressive awesomeness. We had to talk about that.
Excellent. Actually, that was one of the questions that came in from Facebook goes to AfriCOBRA. And it was a very particular question. And it was, were the pieces that the collaborative made exhibited professionally, which I think might mean gallery/museum context, in the time in which they were produced?
That's a great question. So in 1968 and 1969, they did very small exhibitions in Chicago, very, very small collective. There isn't much of a record. But in 1970, when the director of the Studio Museum takes an interest in the group, he organizes AfriCOBRA 1, 10 in Search of a Nation. And so they are then exhibited at 3 different museums: Studio Museum, the African American History Museum in Roxbury, Massachusetts, and then also in Chicago as well. And so this goes on also for AfriCOBRA 2 and AfriCOBRA 3. So yes, they were exhibited in institutions during the time that they were creating them.
Can you say a little more about the challenges from an art historical perspective of evaluating collectives and collaborative? You know, my art history prizes the solitary genius working in isolation who might look at their predecessors. But can you say more about the challenges of talking about a group of artists all at once?
Yeah, and I mean, it ranges, of course, from collective to collective. And it's what's so interesting also about the period of the 60s and 70s more broadly, is that this is where you have individuals giving up some of that autonomy to create a collective aesthetic. You know, so thinking directly about AfriCOBRA, when you look at those works on the screen, they all have that distinct aesthetic. You can look at that and say, that's AfriCOBRA. But yet what's interesting is that there's still enough of an individual element to each of those works, right? That you wouldn't confuse a Donaldson with a Wadsworth Jarrell. So it's challenging, but I find it absolutely fascinating and really interesting. It's of the moment. And And because AfriCOBRA was the first group to really write out, to put pen to paper, what this aesthetic would look like, gives us a really interesting art historical moment to really study that. What are those aesthetics? What were they really trying to convey? And then what were the different interpretations of that? I mean, that's why I find it so fascinating that luminosity and Kool-Aid colors were interpreted differently by members in AfriCOBRA, right?
Thank you. Lots of follow-up questions to AfriCOBRA. I think the collective has grabbed the collective imagination as it did yours. Someone wanted to know about the public reception of AfriCOBRA at its time.
Yeah, they received quite a bit of national acclaim after their 1970 traveling exhibition. So it was written up in both black and white press, very positive, really drawn to the vibrant colors. That's usually what's talked about the most. And there were even some international reviews as well. So this group, once they were able to have their work travel, received that international and national acclaim.
Thank you. I'm going to change question gears on you quickly. A viewer has asked if you could talk about Mailou Jones's Martha's Vineyard painting series.
Excellent. Oh my gosh, someone who knows Jones. A kindred spirit who asked that. So yeah, so Jones spent some summers out in Martha's Vineyard. So again, one of the reasons why I selected Jones was because of this Massachusetts connection. And so she would go out there and she would paint a really interesting series. She would also bring with her other members of the Little Paris group. Delilah Pierce would go out there and also produce scenes of Martha's Vineyard. And I believe actually that the Martha's Vineyard Museum is developing an exhibition that will showcase some of Pierce's paintings and Jones's paintings from this. So if you're really interested in seeing some of her landscape paintings sort of that region sort of throughout her time, sort of stay tuned for that.
Excellent. I wanted to ask a formal question. All the paintings that we looked at, or the artworks that we looked at tonight, are primarily figural, right? They really have strong figural elements. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship of Black art history to abstraction, and whether there was moments where this was a conversation about abstraction versus figuration?
Gosh, it's a great question that brings up quite a lot about art history and the canon. And it would be something that the scholar Kabina Mercer would describe as a burden of representation. And this would have impacted someone even like Tanner, right? So Tanner, in the States, people wanted him to paint a particular way. And he actually really wanted to embrace his own individual desires and intentions as an artist. So even in the 19th century, you have a tension, not necessarily between figuration and abstraction, but what someone should paint. Now, what's really interesting is when you do get into, especially the 1960s, Black abstract artists, and I'm talking here specifically about Black expression, AbX artists, right? So non-representational work. So I'm speaking here of Norman Lewis, William T. Williams, Sam Gilliam, Alan Loving, even Howardina Pindell. These were all artists whose work was received somewhat awkwardly by other Black artists. That their work was seen as insufficiently political by moving away from the figure, and that it was also just too universal. It wasn't specific enough, right? And that's one of the things that AbX is about, is universality. But what's interesting is that now there is a sort of a revision, a interest in these Black expressionists. And in fact, there was just a few days ago an article in the New York Times that talks about new interest and recognition in Black abstract artists such as Norman Lewis. And then when you think about the contemporary moment right now, and you think about contemporary Black artists such as Kahinde Wiley and Amy Sherrill, now you're thinking again about figuration and the figure, right? So these things are somewhat cyclical in art history, and that in terms of Black art history, there has been a preference to really talk about more the figure. So, wasn't able to get in some Black AbX artists, but I'm glad that that question was there, so you can sort of browse and think a bit more about that. Some of the resources in Arts Worcester's resource list will sort of direct you to some of those ABAX artists.
Yeah, thank you for making it clear that there is no way on earth we can possibly talk about the entirety of Black art history in a 59-minute experience. But I think you have really done a wonderful job of introducing us to some new figures and talking us through quite a bit of material in a short time. So with that, I want to thank you. I want to thank everyone who has joined us here on Zoom and our friends out there in Facebook world. And thank you for being part of this. We will have one more in the speaker series this year, and we hope to join you then. Take care and good night. Thank you, Erin.